Hello and welcome to today's training industry webinar, How to Survive and Thrive When Implementing a Large-Scale Training Program. I'm Sarah Gallo, Associate Editor at Training Industry, and I'm so happy you could join us. Before we get started, I would like to quickly go over just a few housekeeping items to make sure we can all interact with today's speaker and get the most out of today's program. Throughout today's event, please feel free to chat any comments you have into your chat window or any questions you have in your Q&A window. We'll address all of these comments and questions either throughout the event, at the end of the program during the Q&A section, or we'll follow up with you later. We do encourage you to share the information you received today with your network on social media. So don't forget to follow the Twitter handle, TTA Training, and the hashtag TIWebinars so we can track your contribution to the conversation. And after today's event, you will be receiving a short evaluation survey. We greatly welcome any feedback you have about today's speaker, content, or anything else you would like to share. And as always, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com. And you will be receiving a follow-up email from us that will include a link to the on-demand program for you to share with your team. If this is your first webinar with us, a special welcome goes out to you. Here at Training Industry, we offer dozens of webinars each year on subjects such as leadership, learning technology, design thinking, and more. We cover just about every topic relevant to leaders of training organizations around the globe. And if you have attended one of our programs in the past, thank you so much for joining us again today. To get things started, let me go ahead and introduce you to today's speaker from TTA, Dr. Michael Noble. Michael Noble is TTA's Chief Operating Officer and Chief Learning Strategist. In addition to leading TTA's sales and operation teams, he works with clients to map their future state objectives and to innovate within their learning organizations. Michael believes that learning and high workplace performance are inextricably connected. He has been an innovator in the digital learning space for almost 20 years, leading award-winning teams, presenting at industry events globally, and sharing ideas in industry publications. He holds a PhD from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, as well as a Master of Arts and Bachelor of Arts degrees from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. All right, and with that, Michael, I'll let you go ahead and kick things off.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I am excited to be with you. I'm coming to you from Westboro, Massachusetts, where TTA is headquartered, and I'm excited to be with you today. You know, we're on our title slide, and I was thinking a little bit about titles. We went back and forth a little bit about what to call this. The title I really wanted to use was taken by somebody else, and I'll tell you what it was. It was High Anxiety, Managing Projects with Your Pants Down. And I think that really captures kind of the spirit that I want to approach this here. There's a certain vulnerability that we have in learning and development, right? We may have a place at the table. We may have certain responsibilities when these large-scale changes are happening in the organization, but in some ways it's like that college dream, if you've had this dream of, hey, I'm showing up at the finals and, you know, somehow, for my final exam, and I discover that I maybe wasn't prepared, I hadn't gone to class, I didn't know I was registered, and maybe I'm not wearing any clothes. So that is kind of where we're at, right? And I want to give you a little bit more than the worst case scenario handbook. If you remember this was like, okay, how do you survive a shark attack? How do you survive, you know, all these kind of crazy situations? The situations that we're going to talk about today are situations that you likely will face in your career as an L&D professional if you are not facing them already. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's kind of where we're going here with our agenda. You know, I think there's kind of a couple main points that I'm hoping you'll get from this today. One is a few kind of thriving strategies, right? Those approaches that give you flexibility and scalability that you can think through in advance, that you can anticipate, where you can develop, and this is the second point, we can kind of develop a capacity for scaling for your team, right? That this is something that you can get better at, that you can develop, and that can become a strength of your organization and your team. So here's the basic flow. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the status quo and normal, why that's important to understand, what some of the challenges are that I'm talking about, how you can get ready, kind of the role of L&D in change management. What does that handshake look like? How do we work together? And share some real world examples with you, and kind of wrap up with talking a little bit about how you can get some help. And of course, we'll have a Q&A at the end. We'll save 15 minutes at the end for your questions. So let's start out talking a little bit about blue sky, because I think, weather's one of those relative things, right? What's normal is determined by geography, climates, the seasons. A beautiful day in January is very different from a beautiful day in May, for example, right? And so equilibrium in your organization, I don't think we often understand that. I think you may feel like you never have equilibrium and that everything's always on fire. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because if that's where we're at, we have to do some analysis and thinking. That's part of our readiness to be able to scale, right? Is understanding that. So let's dive in here a little bit into what I mean. Think about what your status quo is. There's a lot of talk in our industry about kind of the learning technology stack. That may be part of the ecosystem that you need to understand, but you also need to understand your talent, your expertise, how you're serving people, what those processes are. There's a system, and as learning professionals, we love systems. We need to apply it to ourselves and our own teams and how we're working, because we can learn a lot from that experience that is going to help us when the normal is disrupted, right? So it's about understanding your sweet spot. And I've got a few questions here that I think can help you kind of analyze your sweet spot and think through it, maybe in a more comprehensive way, right? First off, think through kind of the types of needs that your team is meeting. There's some examples here. Those same types of needs might be everyday needs for you, or some of those might actually be the big transformative changes that you need to make. And so we'll talk through that. But it's understanding what's the capability of your team today, right? What modalities do you work in? What technologies do you support? What's the skill set and capacity of your team? These are questions that start taking us down a road of, if I know the answers to these things, then I know kind of the opposite. What are we not meeting? Where are we not, and what modalities aren't we working today, right? What technology gaps maybe do we have in our tech stack? And, on my team, where is my team strongest in terms of skill set? The roles in L&D have been changing so much. We've got more specialization. There's deeper knowledge in one area or another. It's kind of important to know that. And I put subject matter expertise on here because this gap becomes our responsibility, even if you may not automatically think of that as your team's responsibility from the beginning. One of the things I think here, you might think a little bit about your leadership style. I was listening to NPR, this was a few years ago, and they were talking about just the psychology of people that make great project managers. And the irony is that they're also like people that worry a lot, and that worrying characteristic is something that helps us plan for the future and have foresight. Well, worry is stressful. It's not a very productive way of doing that. So, if you recognize that in yourself, or you think through that, and I recognize it in myself, the productive way for me to channel that high anxiety is to be ready and be prepared. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit more. Okay. Here we get to the big challenges, right? Let's start talking about this coming storm. What are the needs that you may not be able to handle. What's going to break this system or this status quo that you're so proud of, right? Once you achieve equilibrium, it feels good, right? Because things are rolling, we're getting stuff produced. I've got great relationships with, the business unit leaders, and then all of a sudden something happens that you're like, wow, that is exponentially different from either the kind of work that we do, the scale that we can deliver at, those kinds of challenges. And I've got a couple of poll questions here for us on this, and Sarah's going to help me administer this poll. The first question here, how many of you are currently dealing with a transformation or disruptive change? I'm curious about why you would come to this. Take a couple of seconds to answer them. I might keep on talking. This webinar topic is a little bit specific. I mean, all of us are facing these kinds of challenges, but I'm curious to know what you're doing there. And Sarah's going to open that up to voting.
Yep, everyone take a few seconds to pop your answer into that poll on your screen. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And there you go.
Awesome. So a lot of you are in the midst of the storm, or hopefully in the early stages of the storm, but even if you're in the middle of the storm, I don't want you to give up hope. So the next question is going to tell us a little bit about what kinds of challenges you're dealing with. And I'm going to talk about some of these, but in many ways they're representative. What are you facing now, or what do you anticipate facing in the near future? And I'm really intrigued to see what you do here. So I'll let Sarah administer that poll.
Everyone take a few seconds to pop your answer into that poll on your screen. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Go.
Okay. Interesting. The enterprise system rollout, that's our top challenge that we are facing, certainly a daunting one. And I want to talk a little bit about that one. You've got growth challenges. The other big category, of course, is the other, right? Because a lot of times you can't generalize some of the big pivots that an organization is going to make, but these are, of course, some of the more obvious and big ones there. That is very useful. I'm going to take a screen grab of that and come back to it and think some more about it, but that's very valuable information. We're going to dive a little bit into each of these, and this helps me kind of see what's going to be most relevant for you. So let's think about what I even mean by, what's a big challenge, or what do I mean there? And I want to talk about like quantum leaps, right, for your organization. And I think it's helpful, just back to my example that I used about worrying, it's helpful to scare ourselves a little bit, and then we'll recover from that and we'll come back with a plan. But let's scare ourselves for a little bit about how serious this is and what kinds of challenges we're dealing with. As a vendor, one of the things that I hear all the time is my job depends on this, right? If you have an initiative where you're thinking, wow, my job depends on whether this is successful or not, that's a good indicator that you're dealing with one of those big challenges, right? If you can't handle the mundane and the everyday stuff, okay, we got a level of work to do. But it's these ones in particular that I'm going to focus on today. And of course, this isn't a definitive list. I think the commonalities would be it's enterprise-wide, it's a large pivot, you're not going to have enough time, there's some major gaps in the capacity of your team to deliver on this, and it has this it definitely has an executive kind of focus on the change. They may not be focused on the training and learning side of this, but they are definitely focused on that change. And that's let's go into that a little bit more detail here. With accelerated growth, for example, the connection between accelerated growth and that being a challenge is maybe the most obvious of the things that I put on the list. It's also one of the ones that you're most likely to face, I think, although we had that, the higher category for this audience is definitely that systems rollout. It's interesting that only kind of 0.1% of companies ever reach 250 million in revenue. You know, why are they not growing? What is that obstacle? How do you break through? And then you think about the 45% that say they have a talent shortage, right? This is not an onboarding challenge, which is a big challenge. It's even a talent shortage that they're facing. And so I think those are a couple of just touch points that I want you to think about this. But I think we often think of, oh, I have to handle the growth through like an onboarding challenge, but it's bigger than that. It might be a talent shortage. You might need reskilling. It's also probably a leadership. And that's one reason I love that quote there, is that companies that invest in developing leaders, 2.4 times more likely to hit their performance targets. And that's, I think we think about the influx of new, but we don't necessarily think about how do we build our network leadership in the organization as a way of channeling that. So we'll come back to some solutions in a minute, but where I'm still in scare tactics for a bit here. We know we have problems with new, right? We talked about enterprise systems. Some of these are scary numbers, right? 75% of ERP implementations fail. If you've lived through one of these, they are traumatic, the failures, right? And certainly, you know, I think we think of other kinds of things like system configuration was the problem, or other kinds of you know, we might point the finger other ways. And yet you look at some of the research in Gartner saying, hey, the primary reason is training or the lack thereof in terms of why an enterprise system failed. I don't think that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think we're concerned about how the system's configured, how it's rolled out, you know, use cases, business analysts, all that kind of stuff. With product launches, it's a similar thing, right? We think, well, is it a good product or not a good product, right? But 85% of product launches fail. And the primary reason, this is from a Harvard Business Review article, lack of consumer education, insufficient sales training or enablement. There's a direct correlation there, and that's something that we can influence if we're involved and we're ready to have that influence. With mergers and acquisitions, these are increasing right now, right? 6% of the respondents, you know, are saying, hey, this is something that is going to increase, and there's a high risk of failure rate again. And when I'm looking at the reasons for failure with mergers and acquisitions, it's interesting. You don't see the first finger pointed at learning and training, but you see the reasons for failure end up being, okay, strategy, valuation of the deal. But number 2 is people. Number 3 is due diligence or integration. And I'm thinking, okay, that people part and that integration part are definitely places where we can play and have an influence with that. So, you know, I think, yeah, the reason for failure is probably not that there wasn't training, but that the solution wasn't scalable or didn't work. I mean, we say lack thereof, sometimes there's not training, but often we've provided the same kind of a solution that we would provide in blue sky times. Oh, well, this is what my team does. My team produces web-based training modules, and you've got a problem? Okay, here's a web-based training module for you, right? If we look at managing change, you know, we've got a couple of different things here. Regulatory change could be part of your daily stuff. We've got safety issues. We work in a regulated environment, whether it's financial, whether it's pharma. But I'm talking about something big that happens, right? There's been a change in the law. There's been, you know, some kind of event that is requiring additional scrutiny, additional compliance. You know, this data point here about, you know, 81% say a new regulation is going to lengthen their process. It's going to negatively impact the customer experience, right? The other change over here being global expansion. This one is a little bit like an umbrella. I think these are often hybrid changes, right? So when a global expansion, you're dealing not just with, hey, there's more people, and we think about language and culture and some of those issues, but we're thinking of, okay, we're also have to roll out systems across the organization globally. There may be a talent shortage globally. So you've got a combination challenge in that kind of an issue. And if we look at, how change is being managed in your organization, only 40% say that learning is really aligned with business goals. This has been the case for a long time. One of the points that I would like to make kind of right here, and I'll make it again, is the awesome thing about these kinds of challenges, and this is where I'll move away from the scare tactics a little bit, is the best way to get yourself in alignment is to prove yourself by handling one of these big challenges. That's going to give credibility to your organization. Instead of you getting fired, that's where you're going to get promoted, and that is going to be a really big deal. So assessing your readiness, right? We often talk about readiness when it comes to our learners. I'm thinking of our own readiness, right? And our team's readiness. I think we should be talking about readiness with our stakeholders, our business partners, what we're ready to do, what the kind of work our team can handle. How do we do, having that conversation in advance. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas where you might have that dialogue. We don't have the option in L&D usually of saying, you know what, I'm going to build a bench of people that are ready to go, and they're going to be deployable, right? We may have a little discretion and some contingency, but that's not going to handle the kind of exponential challenge that we've been talking about. And I think about, and this may be an extreme example, but I'm going to use it anyway. You think about like survival movies, right? And the one I'm thinking of is The Martian. That was that one with Matt Damon, and he's on Mars and he's stranded, and the rest of the crew has perished, and he's alone. He's got to try and get home. But first, before he can get home, he has to survive. And that kind of survival takes a few things, right? It takes some experience, some resourcefulness. You also have to have some raw materials. He had things that he used to be able to do that. I want to talk about what kinds of raw materials you want to have in place so that you can get yourself in that right mindset. And then when you're in that crisis situation, respond to it. Here's just a few of the points, and we'll hit on some of these in a little bit more detail as we go on. They turn to learning. What's interesting is usually in these situations, and I've been on a number of, both where there was a really strong change management strategy and where there was not much. But it's not like the main force, right? The vector that's driving this, that change, they're struggling to keep up with that, right? Let's talk about systems rollouts in particular. You're trying to develop a solution on a system that is not finished yet. It's not fully configured yet, right? It's behind. It's usually behind. Oh, I looked at one point about the average delay in that kind of a system rollout. It's usually behind by months. So they're struggling to catch up with that. And yet you're responsible for rolling out the training related to that. So here are some of the areas that I think really impact scalability. So I want to talk about those. One of them is strategy. If you have a team that's primarily oriented towards production of a certain modality, or hey, we're meeting certain kinds of needs in our organization, you may have a gap in terms of strategy. That matters because I think the temptation in a crisis situation is to throw strategy out the window and say, oh, we don't have time for that. We got to roll. Something is better than nothing. And what I'm going to invite us to think about is that something is not better than nothing and may damage the credibility of your learning organization, may frustrate all of your learners. There could be serious impact for just, hey, we're just going to roll, right? Thought before prior action, right? Thinking before we do something is really important, and making sure you have the right kind of scale and thought work there available. And you may have to talk kind of your stakeholders into that. Some of these other points, the scalability, I'm talking on this particular scalability, I'm talking about people scalability, right? Your core team, what can they do? Do you have a good mapping of their competencies and what they're capable of doing? And even down to the level of what can they actually, at their max, what can they get done, right? Do you have flex leadership if you have to expand that team, right? Where are those, there's points that you could bend, looking at the agility, the response time, expertise. I'm not going to talk about each one of these in detail. Think about this as if you're MacGyver, this is your, bubble gum and, I think a Swiss Army knife. You need your multi-purpose tools. These are the multi-purpose tools that are going to get you through that situation. I mentioned the kind of scalability that I was talking about on the last screen. And I think this is one of those concepts that we don't put enough thought into because it's more complex. There are multiple variables at play, right? At the bottom there, we think our usual thought process is, oh, I'm developing this training, I can develop it across multiple people, that is scale, right? That's scalable delivery, right? Maybe I have a training model that I can replicate and deliver to that audience. There I've got a scalable design. But you start combining those, and it's more than two factors at work there, right? And these variables are interdependent. Sometimes you have to think about the scalability of flaws. Think, for example, oh, this little problem that I have when dealing with a small group of people, what happens to that problem in my design as it scales out across the world? Okay, maybe I've got a gap in my materials that are being used in the classroom. I happen to have a knowledgeable instructor there that fills it in, right? But then I roll that design out around the whole world. That problem gets magnified, right? And becomes a bigger issue. So scalability is one of those things that can work for us. It can also work against us. We usually think about it in terms of, oh, well, that saves us cost, right? But there's a trade-off, I think, and it's understanding what those trade-offs are. And I think applying that principle to more than just cost, to the people, to the tools and resources, and even to logistics and things like that is going to make a difference. And I'm going to point out some of those variables because, what I'd love to give you a calculator so that when you're in that situation, you can say, okay, this is how I'm going to price out the impact and what we need in order to be able to hit these objectives. Because one of those things I think is we take our past experience, which may have been blue sky experience or the experience of our status quo, and we try to take those same estimating tools and apply them in a crisis situation, and it doesn't work. So, I can't give you that calculator, but I can give you some of my thoughts at least on how you might think about advanced planning with the money side of this, because there is a money side of it. Part of it is you really have to understand your yearly budget, what it costs you to do the status quo, right? Internal, external costs, the cost of training per employee, how much is being consumed, what you're actually producing. If you've dealt with contingencies in the past, and I'm differentiating a contingency from maybe there's a surge need or something, it's not like an organizational change, it's just a temporary surge or something. How have you dealt with that on your team, right? All the way to the disruptive change budget, right? What kinds of needs are there? How do I quantify that? What are the baseline costs plus the additional costs? Plus, one of the things that happens when you condense or crash a timeline, of course, is that costs tend to go up and that you get more of those problems magnified. So here's some of the line items that you might have there on your budget. I mean, otherwise, you're just kind of flying by the seat of your pants, and you're just going to deliver kind of your status quo solution, which may have been appropriate for that, but isn't going to match the bigger need. So, I think as you think through these variables, you want to think of how do costs scale and what influences the costs, whether that's people, content that you're using, the opportunity cost or time. These are some of the variables that I think you want to think through. And if you've had growth in your organization, you've already got some experience in okay, how do I handle basic growth? But you want to know, where would you anticipate your system failing? Because that's where you can come do some backup. And also, of course, knowing the strengths, like we really have a lot of expertise, but we're going to have a hard time, scaling globally with that expertise. So let's take another poll question here. This one, I wanted to better understand from you kind of which of these variables that I just introduced you think like, hey, this one's the biggest disruption to my status quo, right? The thing that I'm most worried about, I think this would be the stress points. What are the stress points for you? And Sarah's going to administer that, so go ahead and answer.
Yep, all right, everyone, take a few seconds to pop your answer into that poll. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. There you are.
Interesting. So the people stress point is the one that, and that's interesting, people and time. I struggled with putting time on the list because I was like, it's really different in kind from some of these other variables, but then all of them are different from each other, and there's a lot of overlap with these. That's interesting. We can talk a little bit more about people. In fact, in some of the examples that I'm going to use, scalability of people is one of the ways that I've seen some organizations be able to have some wins there. So let's jump into change management a little bit. I think most learning and development professionals certainly have some exposure to change management, and if there's a change management group in your organization, you've already got a close relationship with them. I think everyone needs to basically kind of understand this, because this is the context of where we work, and this is kind of what the role of learning should be at an organizational level, at least, is scaffolding that kind of change. And so we're going to talk through that a little bit. Here's a model that I think scales well for many types of large change initiatives, and I'm going to talk you through it a little bit. So in the center there, you've got the change catalyst, whatever that event or change is, right? On the left, you've got, kind of the old way of thinking, not so much the past, but the old way of thinking. On the right side, you've got the future, or the new way of thinking in the future state. Up top, you've got high performance. Down low, you've got low performance. Really, we want it to be in that quadrant of, high performance, achieving our future state, right? And there's a progression that happens naturally when something is going really well from a change standpoint. People kind of understand what's there, they're prepared for it, they've developed the new capabilities they need, they understand the value, and they start to bring value, and they're truly engaged in that, and they can champion that, right? That's a really nice change curve there. If your change is not going well or not managed well, we all have experienced this, sadly enough. People misunderstand, why are we making that change, right? Why is leadership doing this to us? They're out of touch. They don't know how we really do things here, right? And they avoid practicing the new thing, whatever it is, putting it into place, whether it's a mindset, whether it's a technology, and some of your best people could turn into what I call counter leaders, where they're still leading, they've still got influence in the organization, but they're, hey, that's not really how we do things. Let me show you kind of the best way, right? This is the way we really should be doing it. Yeah, ignore that. And once those workarounds have been developed, right, that's totally sabotaging the change that you were going for. So if we look at those markers up on that kind of upper right quadrant, that's where I want to dive a little deep and kind of see, hey, if we want our performance to increase, we're going from that change up to continued growth, learning and development, what role can we play, right? And this is the challenge. Up until now, it's like there's been like the silver bullet. Okay, I've got this big system rollout. Well, I've got to do my system training, and then I've met that need, and the change happens. I'm trying to complicate it a little bit more so that you can actually get real performance change with that rollout and not just meet the need, right? Meeting the need is like coverage. Who knows if it was effective or not, right? We got to take our best practices from change management and from learning and help everyone understand the why of that. It lays a foundation, right? This is a journey. This isn't just a one-hit wonder, right? We got to look at what kind of learner experience we're creating and kind of map that over time. I've got some representative strategies here that you might use in some of these instances. Obviously, these modalities and things could be used for lots of different things, but some of these are ones that I think could be specifically used to, for example, help people achieve their performance targets or bring that value to the organization, for example. Okay, so I'm going to go to some of the lessons and takeaways, some of the examples. I think there's something to learn from some of these things. I'm going to go to the same list that I had before, and I want to talk through just some of the examples that I've seen. So this first one here is an accelerated growth situation. This was an organization, really technical organization, chemicals, materials. They have these product engineers that have all of this expertise. They're all retiring. Meanwhile, the business is growing. And guess what? We've got a year-long onboarding into this really highly technical role. So you think, okay, how do we approach this from a scalability standpoint? Well, we've got to support all these new people over the course of a year. Well, no, right? The right solution was to bring in strategy. So strategy was the piece here that needed to scale, which was looking at, hey, let's look at this whole year-long process. Can we get that down to 90 days, right? So there was a needs analysis component to this, which was that, hey, we've got to start out with the right thought work here. You know, another example with a systems rollout, rolling out a new CRM to the organization. The problem is usually, and this is one of those hybrids, right? It's usually because of growth. It's usually because, hey, we've got some other things we're trying to do here. This one was a people gap, right? So we talk about scalability. The solution for this organization was being able to bring in a team that already had, you know, kind of on-demand trainers that kind of knew this subject matter area, because there wasn't enough time to upskill people internally on the CRM and be able to hit the rollout target with a product launch. Another quick example here with product launch, right? You have cloud-based technical products that are rolling out around the world. You have a sales team that's not technical. There's been a lot of lag. So by the time it gets to you, you don't have very much time left. And yet there's this expectation of, hey, we've got to provide the sales enablement pieces that we need, right? How do we do that in a very short period of time? And, you know, here the solution was a couple of things. It was certainly scalability of people, but also doing the design and development of a solution that could scale, right? It's like, hey, if we took our normal solution, no, there's no way we could be able to deliver it in that amount of time. So let's get creative about what's going to be the most impactful thing that we could do there, you know, with mergers and acquisitions. And I like this particular example because, you know, working with a large financial organization, they acquired another financial organization. So you're merging two cultures, but they were in the midst of an enterprise system rollout at the same time. You know, the flex that they needed because of the scale was an additional 500 instructors per week. If you think about that type of scalability, how would you solve that particular problem, right? In their case, not only did it have to be the right instructors, they were specialized, they had to be qualified, they had to be, they had to go through their T3. Those are the types of, I think, not just a talent challenge in addition to just a people challenge. So while I agree that there's that people challenge there, how are we going to get the people that we need? There's a logistical and ramp up challenge that has to be met that we may not think of immediately. Another example that I would share would be, hey, a utility company, there's this disruptive safety event, you know, something has happened, people have been hurt, that resulted in changes in the law, increased scrutiny. You know, what this organization did, they already had flexibility built into their system. They were already making use of kind of agile talent or on-demand talent. And what that experience helped them do was pivot and say, okay, we can now scale up in these ways because we already have that strategy in place. And I think the lesson learned from that is to practice at a smaller scale some of your stretch exercises. Okay, how are we going to handle this? And learning from those so that when you are in that kind of that under that intense scrutiny and have to respond to some kind of change, you've got what you need. And this last example here would be, this is a global example. They're rolling out it's a tech company. They have this talent shortage globally. I talked about that being one of the main areas and difficulties with global expansion. And, you know, they looked at that challenge. They said, hey, we're in a technology industry. We're looking for people with a computer science background. There simply aren't people with that background. How would we develop or upskill people to meet that need? And created a boot camp in country to find kind of non-traditional applicants, qualify, assess them, put them through a boot camp to be able to meet that global expansion kind of challenge. And I think what you're seeing with all of these examples, I hope, is that the common thread is that there was some area where they could give or that they had to get help, right? So we're gonna, you know, they've got, hey, we've got these capabilities, we need help in certain areas. So I want to talk about some of the kinds of help that you might look for and what you might do there. I had one client that, this was a long time ago. I was so impressed. I was working at a large financial organization, and during tax season, things went crazy in that organization. We cross-trained all the people whose normal job wouldn't be to be on the phone. We cross-trained the organization so everybody could be on the phone during that time period. And it was built into the culture that we knew, hey, tax season's coming. I normally do this, but during this time of year, I'm gonna know our system and our practices well enough to be able to help customers during that period. And that's more of a recurring surge need that's unique to their organization. But I think it shows that puffer fish kind of flexibility of how are we gonna grow when we need to. Hopefully it's not for self-defense. So I talked a little bit about, scaring you. Now I want to talk a little bit about kind of attitudinal shift. And I could have started with this, but I think this might actually be a good place to kind of start to wrap things up a little bit. So think about the kinds of things that you've heard, and I think most of you will recognize these phrases. Now isn't the time to introduce something new, right? What if it's now is the time to try something new? We don't have the available resources. Now is the time that we can kind of expand and develop our capabilities. We can't innovate. We're playing catch up. I think that's where, hey, let's think through the best approach given the constraints. And that's where strategy, I think, really comes into play. We weren't involved early enough. That one, I think, is a little bit of a cop-out because it's never going to be early enough. That's the nature of these things. Is some of it, you can do your best preparation, and part of it is being willing to, hey, this is going to make my career, it's going to make my team. We're going to grow and develop as part of this change as well. And so, it's like, hey, how are we going to support that change management strategy? Less grumbling about not being included. Sadly, I think we all hear these quite frequently. So I'm going to end here. I want to talk a little bit about, I think the thought is, oh, well, I've got to have, what's my talent stack look like, my tech stack? You're looking at different kinds of factors. I've mentioned strategy. We've talked about design and development. Part of it may be the management of the solution itself, right? If there's multiple contractors and vendors involved, there's so many moving parts there. That's one of those things that I talked about, the scalability of problem areas. If there's not a good process or system for that, it won't scale. And then that thing that was maybe peripheral now becomes the reason why the training solution maybe had the best training program, but it never got delivered, or there were patches of places in the world where that didn't get rolled out. And even thinking about, hey, what's available, that's part of the, that's your Swiss Army knife that you can have available and ready to go. So I think some of this is looking at today, where do I stretch? And that's where I'd kind of go back to the kind of my two things would be, you know, the thriving strategies. It's going to be different in your organization. You're going to have different gaps. But if you can think about the capability of your team, expanding it in these areas or in some other areas, and that can be through partnerships in your own organization, partnerships with vendors. I think we think about, okay, I've got this solution, it's going to scale. Knowing the limits of the scalability and where you're likely to run into problems is one of those issues there. So let's open it up to questions. I'm eager to hear kind of some of the things that you might challenge me on here. Sarah.
Yes, it looks like we do have a few questions for you. Your first one is from Arthur, who asked what your definition of gamification is.
Yeah, I think gamification is one of those things, right, that's a little bit of a buzzword. You can gamify things by adding game elements to lots of different things. You know, I think, you know, we could do a whole separate webinar on gamification, and, you know, there's a lot of people out there with some good resources on gamification. I'd refer you to Carl Kapp and some of his work on gamification that he's been doing. You know, I think in the context of a big change, one of the things that can be valuable is gamifying some elements so that you might engage people in you know, helping them get kind of enthusiastic about the change, right? And tracking certain key metrics. And it might be the rollout, which teams are rolling out most effectively, who's got some of this, tying that into your change management strategy, I think is a good thing. But I'm going to keep a really broad definition because, you know, that we've been talking about games forever, long before gamification was a thing. But here we're talking about taking specific elements. Hopefully we can apply them to some aspect of that change that can accelerate or get people excited about it.
Perfect. And your next question is from Stephanie, who said, in terms of counter leaders, what if the counter leader is actually correct and able to support that they're doing what is best for the company in spite of leadership's bad decisions? In other words, what if your leaders are actually your biggest challenge in scaling training to support the company's and customers' true requirements?
So that's a really interesting question. And Stephanie, I'm not going to call you a counter leader. that is why that is so seductive, right? It's that those people really feel like, oh, this is better. They're not doing it to subvert the change. They're doing it because in the best interest of the organization, we've got to get our work done, right? The way to fight that is a strategy. It's, I think, an influencer strategy, so that from the beginning, you're pulling in some of those people that are going to have influence with their peers, and you're bringing them in as change ambassadors, right? And they are understanding that buy-in from the beginning or impacting the change. And if the change is being architected and designed in isolation, yeah, it's hard to make up for that with a learning and development strategy. But those are a couple of my ideas on that particular challenge.
Great. And it looks like Tara just asked if you have some quick tips for thriving in chaos. Any points of advice you can offer there?
So I think this is a very good question. It goes back to one of those first points that we made about knowing your equilibrium. And you're like, well, we never have equilibrium here. It's always one thing after another. We're chronically understaffed, right? This is where I think mapping out the chaos, getting a good snapshot of what the chaos looks like is kind of the first step. And that is about tracking, right? What do we have going? How are we doing it? What balls are getting dropped? I think the role of the learning leader here is to start to create the system. This is where you apply your needs analysis skills kind of to your own team and say, hey, you know, we have to understand what the need is in order for us to actually break through the chaos. And I think that does look different depending on what the kind of challenges it is. And then you choose to be able to execute on something, right? I think most of us have heard really great advice about this, which is, you know, your team can accomplish one priority at a time, one or two. Don't list out, you know, so many different priorities that you can't, that you know, all your efforts get dispersed across too many different priorities. And so there's a analysis, there's a prioritization, and certainly a cooperation is required from stakeholders and other leaders, but I think creating that transparency and map is key there.
Great. And Anthony wants to know, what advice do you have when implementing a new product at a different company, maybe in a different location that may have a different culture? How can training managers go about that?
So I like this question because I think we use culture as shorthand for a lot of different things. And we can say, oh, we've got this team over here. I think it's helpful to put names on what some of those culture challenges might be. What are some of these differences? Let's understand the differences that exist. And I think that's the work that we don't do, partly because we have this word culture that we use to mean so many different things. If we can define what we mean by that difference, I think that's the first step in that. I mean, with product launch in particular, you know, you might need a different sales enablement strategy for different markets. And, you know, that's something that hopefully, you know, with the right collaboration with the sales leaders, right, is vital. That's another thing I think that happens too much, is it's assigned to learning and development instead of, hey, I get to collaborate with the sales leaders on how we're going to make this successful. And hopefully that kind of partnership would facilitate that.
Perfect. And it looks like Jerome asked, would you put a change in leadership into the same category as these other transformations?
I think it depends at what level, right? Is a different leader coming in place because there was a big, you know, was there a scandal, right? Or is it a natural change, or is it a pivot in the organization? And if the organization is pivoting, yes. What is the nature of that pivot? What's the nature of that change? And maybe that new leader has a different idea on the direction of the organization. And that, you know, it would be refreshing, wouldn't it, if each new leader viewed kind of their first challenge as a change management challenge of, hey, you know, we've got to tackle this big change across the whole organization. In some organizations, they've had the same leadership for, you know, years and years. Other organizations, they're used to getting a revolving door of leadership. Smaller organizations or family organizations, that's going to be a pretty big change. So I'd look at that in analyzing that particular question.
Great. And Heather wants to know how you would deal with a stakeholder that doesn't appreciate the value of training.
Yeah, there's a lot of stakeholders probably that may not appreciate the value of training, right? Their experiences have been, I went through this thing, it was a waste of time or it was boring. And based on that, they've decided they don't need us. I think we actually feel that stronger than it actually is. When you look at like survey results of leadership, they actually rate training as pretty critical, right? They may not think their organization is doing it well or right, or they may not be completely bought in. So I think if you're dealing with a big change and you've got a leader that just doesn't understand, maybe you don't call what you're doing training. Maybe you look at what the needs are and you start talking about it based on, hey, there's this need, it's a communication need, it's a change management need, maybe it's not a training need. And being a little bit more flexible in our kind of vocabulary and on our solution set. Because maybe that leader is just thinking, oh, they're just going to give me a PowerPoint deck or e-learning module, and what I really need is, something more impactful. And even having that conversation, we were talking here internally the other day about the credibility that comes from being vulnerable, and that, I think that's one of those conversations that if you have with that stakeholder, hey, I know you've probably experienced some bad training experiences in the past. We're going to use this as an area to grow. In order to do that, I want to know kind of why you think this wouldn't be an effective solution or what might work instead.
Great. Next, we have a question from Jacob, who wants to know, when you're brought in late, how do you actually set the right expectations?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd call it there is the word late. As soon as we think it's too late, we're already saying, well, whatever we do is going to be, second, it's not going to be successful, right? We were brought in too late. We can't do it. And that's where I think the response is let's get together and do some thought work and come out, what would be the most impactful thing that we can do in this situation, right? That is so much stronger than figuring out how to backtrack and make up for lost time. And that also indicates a failure to scale process. We didn't really flag process as one of the scalability issues, but if you have this waterfall process that's very locked down, sometimes it's hard for team members to envision something more agile, where they might turn around something quickly that could be impactful, even if it doesn't maybe make its way through your full process, right? Or maybe you could get through 1 or 2 sprints before the delivery, and then maybe even keep working on it after that.
All right. I think we have time for one last question. This one is from Mary, who wants to know, what soft skills do you think training managers need when going through a major change at their organization?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You look at some of what are, as they kind of map out which soft skills are kind of in most demand, most of those do match up with what learning leaders need, because I think learning leaders, like other leaders in the organization, it's about emotional intelligence. It's about being able to build trust. There was a quote on LinkedIn the other day that I was looking at that said something about, hey, they can't hear you if they don't trust you. And I'm like, oh yeah, that ability to create trust, and that comes from that emotional intelligence of understanding, how do I present myself as credible? And part of that is not going into the crisis situation with our heads cut off, right? Is going into the crisis situation with, wow, a lot of kind of ideas and creativity and respect for the situation. I think we think about, I lament a little bit that, sometimes we think of our role as, okay, it's what tools do you know, right? But here in that Learning Leader Toolkit, I think there's a planning, time management, the ability to do some budgeting, those kind of fall in between. But I think the number one there I'd put would be kind of the emotional intelligence and trust building, the analytical, the critical thinking, those skills there.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for some great content today.
And thanks everybody. It was fun to put together. I wish we could all be in the same room and I could, kind of see your faces and interact, but I've appreciated the time that you've given me today.
Great. All right, and I would like to invite all of you to join us for some of our other upcoming training industry webinars. You can go ahead and register for these programs and watch past webinars at trainingindustry.com. And of course, all training industry webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour by CPTM, SHRM, and ISPI certifications. What is CPTM? The Certified Professional in Training Management Program assists you in developing the core competencies and skills needed to manage the future training needs of your organization. You can participate in a number of practicums held within the U.S. or join us for a virtual practicum from anywhere across the globe. Learn more about the program at trainingindustry.com/CPTM. And don't forget that early bird registration is now open for TICE 2020, happening June 16th through 18th here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Visit trainingindustry.com/TICE to secure your spot. All right, Michael, thank you again for some awesome content today. And of course, thank you to our sponsor, TTA. Of course, a thank you also goes out to all of you for joining us for today's event. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.